Okay, thank you. So it is a big honor, a privilege for me today to introduce Dr. Sarah Robin McGregor Murray. Dr. Murray is a professor of psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College of London. He was born in Scotland. He was trained in medicine at the University of Glasgow, and then he completed his residency at the Moseley Hospital in London at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. So Dr. Murray is ranked one of the most influential researchers in psychiatry by Thomson Reuters Science Watch, and the third most influential psychiatrist for schizophrenia research. Indeed, Dr. Murray was the first psychiatrist that started to study the connection between cannabis and psychosis about 30 years ago, when in the 70s, 80s, people thought that cannabis was not dangerous. He was one of the first. His seminal work was very impressive to understand the link between cannabis and psychosis. So today he will just show his seminal work on the link about cannabis and psychosis. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation to be in this beautiful city. I'm very pleased to be here and to have the chance to learn a lot about what's happening here in Canada. So I have had support from GW Pharmaceuticals, who grow cannabis in the UK and make actually Sativex. I've also had speaker honoraria from various other mainstream drug companies. So if we start with US presidents, when was the last US president who, excuse me, I can't say that any longer because of the present one, but other than the present president, that all recent presidents of the US have used cannabis. Bill Clinton, those of you older members will remember that he did not inhale, that he's very clever with words. He did not have sexual intercourse with Monica, of course. Here is George Bush, and I think it's unfair to, he used cannabis, he used alcohol, he used other drugs. I think it's probably unfair to blame his cognitive difficulties on cannabis. Here is Barack Obama. This is a spoof picture, of course. Here is the current president. Has he ever used cannabis? No. Has he ever smoked a cigarette? No. Has he ever drunk alcohol? No. And apparently these are all true. At least nobody has come forward to deny it. He has an older brother who died of alcoholism. So it is curious, isn't it, that the daftest one of them all has not used cannabis. And I say this because the vast majority of people, I guess, as we've heard from Benedict, cannabis is a bit like alcohol. The vast majority of people who use it moderately and sensibly and don't come to any harm. But as with alcohol, a proportion of people drink a bottle of vodka a day or a couple of bottles of wine a day, and they increase the risk of harm. And I guess that's what we've learned about cannabis. This is really just a summary slide of the prospective studies, the longitudinal studies looking at cannabis use and risk of psychosis. So this is a bit like the old studies where they looked at tobacco smoking in the general population, then followed them up to see whether people then developed lung cancer or not. So the last column here, and this is the odds ratio for comparing those who have never in their life used cannabis with those who have used it once or more. So, and of course, it's unlikely that once or twice is going to have any effect. So it's mostly through the effect through the heavier users. And you can see that the biggest study is this one which was originally Andreasen and Alabek in the Swedish Army study published in 1987, but now the people have been followed up for 35 years. And if you look at those who have used versus not used, then there's a significant increase. But if you look at the whole list, then in every study, the risk is higher in those who have used. There are actually now 13 studies, of which 10 have had a significantly increased odds ratio in those who have used cannabis. 3 studies have not found that. They've underpowered studies which have really shown a trend in the same direction. So, but these are modest effects. This is nothing like the effect of 60 cigarettes a day. And so there have been, of course, a number of skeptics over the years as to whether cannabis actually induces the psychosis or whether it's an epiphenomena. So, for example, it was thought, and I must say, I was not very early in realizing the adverse effects of cannabis. We used to see people in the 1990s and see families, and the mother or brother would say, well, do you think his psychosis could have anything to do with all the cannabis he's taking? And I would say, no, there's no evidence of that. There's a Lancet editorial in 1996 saying cannabis is an entirely safe recreational drug. So it was only when we repeatedly had families say this that we began to think perhaps we should look at this. Then we found that cannabis users had a worse outcome of their psychosis, and then we began to wonder in the early 2000s whether cannabis actually might have causal effects. So I used to believe, and many psychiatrists believe, that cannabis was taken to treat symptoms or prodromal symptoms. Poor souls, they're hallucinating, they're deluded. If they enjoy a few puffs of cannabis, what's the harm in that? That certainly used to be my attitude. But now there are lots of studies that have looked at that. If you actually inquire of people with a psychotic diagnosis, why they take cannabis, it's the same reasons as for everybody else, for enjoyment. Even although they sometimes know that they get a bit paranoid for a while, they still like the high. So there's no evidence that people are taking it for negative symptoms or to counteract the effects of antipsychotics. Maybe in some cases there is a transient decrease in anxiety. But in general, the idea that this is self-treatment, the self-treatment hypothesis has pretty well been discarded. It could be that the people who are using cannabis are also using amphetamines or cocaine, and it could be that the effects are secondary to that. But in a number of the studies, they've tried to control for that. And so insofar as you can control for that particular confounder, you still, if you control for amphetamines, if you control for cocaine, and so on, then you still get a significant effect of alcohol. So these two ideas, I think, have been discarded. It is certainly true that there's insufficient evidence of dose response. And we know that your chances of lung cancer are different if you smoke 60 cigarettes a day than if you smoke 3. And usually, most of these studies I've quoted are just saying, have you ever used cannabis? And it's as scientific as saying, have you ever smoked a cigarette or have you ever drunk alcohol? So there has been insufficient evidence of a dose response. And it's often said there's no evidence on an effect on incidence. Well, it's very difficult to look at incidence over time in psychosis because the epidemiology is just so poor. There is only one longitudinal study which has looked at the incidence of psychosis since the 1960s to the 2000s using the same methods, and that's ours in South London. Over that time, the incidence of psychosis and schizophrenia has doubled. But we know that the major effect on that was migration, because migrants have a high incidence of psychosis. So really, it's not really been possible to address that question. And it's because of the poverty of epidemiological studies in psychiatry. If we were talking about cancer or coronary artery disease, we would have studies of hundreds of thousands of cases. in psychiatry, we're talking about hundreds of cases. Then another suggestion has been that there may be common genes predisposing to cannabis use and to psychosis. So it may be you get genes which are increasing your risk of developing psychosis and schizophrenia, and one of the epiphenomena of that is it makes you more likely to use cannabis. And that's been quite a popular notion as well. So in general, in Europe, I don't think there are any clinical psychiatrists who have investigated the issue who do not think that cannabis is a causal component cause of cannabis. I know that because I used to get invited to debate the subject, and I still do get invited to debate the subject, but they often have to cancel the debate because they can't find anybody to disagree and say that cannabis is not causing psychosis. So this is, it's a bit disappointing. I get invited to places like Vienna or Monaco, and then they say, can you think of anybody who, and I give them a few names, and then they all cop out. So then I get disinvited. So anybody who would like to come to debates, please let me know. So one of the studies that we did, or excuse me, you know what professors are like. When we say that studies that we did, we mean studies that somebody else did, that a PhD student or someone like that. So this is a study that we did by piggybacking on a famous cohort group in New Zealand. And this was 1,200 children who'd been followed up about 10 times in childhood, and that actually have now been followed up to age 52, and with a 96% follow-up rate. They give them birthday cards and presents and invitation. You know, somebody who was born in Dunedin and now lives in Montreal, they'll give them a free ticket back to Dunedin in order to participate in the study. So when you look at people in this cohort who were using cannabis by age 18 and got a diagnosis of schizophrenia-like psychosis at 26, then the odds ratio is 1.6. So it's a weak effect. It's non-significant. But if you look at those who started using cannabis by age 15, then the odds ratio was 4.5. So this started off a sort of notion that it's early use that carries the risk. And a number of other studies have also shown that. Animal studies also show that if you look at juvenile rats, you can mess up their cognition much more readily by giving them the ingredients of cannabis than you can of adult rats. It has to be said that there is a confounder in this, that if you actually start using cannabis by 12, then you've got a lot more years to keep using it by 26 than if you start by 18. So it's to some extent confounded by the length of use. Maybe you're more likely to become dependent if you start early, and maybe it's the length of use that has the effect. But in practice, I think certainly my clinical experience is it's people who start early, that most of the cases of psychosis we see have started early. Sometimes in London at 11 or 12, our earliest has been 9. So early use seems to be an effect, although I'm cautious about the idea that the juvenile brain is more vulnerable. The question of the extent of use we addressed in this study, and this is work of Drs. Marconi and Vassos, and this really addresses the question of how much cannabis. So if these are the different studies. So this is an early American study of Tien in 1990, and this is our last study in South London. And here are the 20% who took the least cannabis. Here are the 20% who took the most cannabis. And you can see in every study, the 20% who took the most cannabis had an increased risk of psychosis. Not very much in this old American study. And these studies, to a much greater extent, I think this is probably related to the increasing potency of cannabis, particularly in the UK. So, but overall, if you're in the top 20%, then the odds ratio, which has disappeared off the end here, was about 4. So the heaviest users had about four times more likely chance of developing psychosis. So we and colleagues have done quite a number of experimental studies. So in this one, we took people who were schizotypal, and therefore they're more, you might say they're more likely to develop psychosis if you expose them to a risk factor. 121 schizotypal individuals randomized to either THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, or placebo. And we then put them in a virtual reality situation. What they saw was entering the London underground. And I don't know what the situation is here in Montreal, but in the London Underground, you sit and you look at people, but you don't speak to them. And if they get your eye contact, you get on eye contact, you get embarrassed and you look away. So it's a slightly stressful environment. So when we take normal people and they go into this and they go into the tube, or they appear to go into the tube, then these various humanoid-looking characters do various things. They turn to their friend and laugh, or they sort of look up, or they smile, and so on. And it's interesting that ordinary people diverge very greatly in what they think. You know, that one lady will say of a particular man, oh, he looked up at me, he really fancies me, he thinks I'm really attractive. Another one will say, that man looked at me in a very hostile way. So there's quite a lot of variability. But if you take the people who have been given THC and compare them with the people who have been given a placebo, then you can show that the people who have been given THC, and this is intravenously, I should have said, then they get more paranoia. So it's quite easy to induce paranoia in an experimental setting with intravenous THC. And of course, so tetrahydrocannabinol is the major psychotogenic factor in cannabis. You can produce paranoid ideas. You can also produce hallucinations, though paranoia is more predominant. And anybody who's tried to speak to somebody who's stoned will know that they may think they're getting a new understanding of the mysteries of the universe, but they can't remember the sentence that you've asked them to reply to. So in sufficient amounts, then cannabis obviously can impair memory and can impair, you can see this easily on a fMRI study, that say you don't get activation in the hippocampus in the normal way. And then, of course, there's cannabidiol, which in many ways is thought of as the good guy in cannabis, which is not hallucinogenic, has some anxiety-relieving properties, and may antagonize the effects of THC. So in old-fashioned cannabis that we used to have available in the UK, you had about 3 or 4% of THC balanced by about 3 or 4% of CBD. And so here is a study that this chap, Paul Morrison, did. So we again used intravenous THC, and this is the PANS score. This is the positive psychosis score. These are normal people. We've done about 92 now, and they get randomized either to the placebo, and if you get a placebo, then you don't have any effect, not surprisingly, on your psychotic ratings. If you get THC, then you get a blip in psychotic ratings, which disappears after a couple of hours. People varied very much here. And if you'd taken cannabis 1,000 times, people hardly noticed. Some of them said, I must have got the placebo. If you, on the other hand, had only used cannabis 2 or 3 times, some people got quite a big effect, and we had to rescue a few by giving them a benzodiazepine. But what about the effect of, so you can reliably induce paranoid symptoms by giving intravenous THC, but of course this is in a laboratory setting. This is not with your mates on a Saturday night. So it's a bit stressful. There's somebody there with white coats asking you every 15 minutes how you feel and so on. And so it's actually, it is, one of the things is, of course, in all of these studies, they are conditional on the individual telling you the truth. Because I certainly remember one lady that we gave her the THC, and she looked very strange and spaced out and sort of looking around in a very distracted and distressed way. And whenever we asked her how she was feeling, she says, absolutely fine. No anxiety, no suspiciousness, nothing at all. The next day, she emailed us and said, I'm very sorry, I hope I didn't mess up your study. I was so totally paranoid, I thought you were out to kill me. Therefore, I wasn't going to cooperate with the study. And she was right, as soon as she left as soon as she could. But psychiatrists will know that this is the situation with your patients. That sometimes you think they're getting better, but it's just that they're getting insufficient insight not to tell you about their hallucinations and delusions because they don't want haloperidol or some antipsychotic drug or to be kept in hospital. So this is the effect of CBD. So in the top line, here are people who got a placebo and then were given THC. And you can see that they again showed some psychotic symptoms. And here are people who were given CBD. And this was quite a big dose of CBD we gave them. And then in this case, we seem to abort the extent of the psychotic symptoms. And there's other evidence that CBD does seem, in experimental settings, to diminish the psychotogenic effect of THC. Indeed, GW Pharmaceuticals carried out a trial of cannabidiol as an antipsychotic. There had been a previous small study in Germany. And so this was taking people who had a diagnosis of established schizophrenia, were getting an antipsychotic, and then they got in addition either a placebo or a CBD. So we participated in this trial, and actually the result was that CBD was superior to placebo, the most notable differences being in the positive phase subscale. So we were very enthusiastic about this and the possibility that CBD might be of use as an adjunctive treatment for schizophrenia. Actually, the company were not very impressed by this, and they decided they would make more money, I think, in growing cannabis for treating childhood epilepsy. So actually, GW Pharmaceuticals have sadly given up and are not proceeding with this. So what will happen to this, I'm not sure. Anyway, this is cannabis potency. We heard from Benedict that cannabis had been getting stronger in Canada and the USA, and of course it's the same in England. This is cannabis resin. This is the one that used to be 3 or 4% THC. Maybe it got up to about 6% at one point, and by 2008 it was back about 5%. Here is what we call imported herbal cannabis or marijuana, and it got a bit stronger by 2008. And here is what in the UK is called skunk. Oh, sorry, I should say that I like to tell people that drug dealers in South London are quite generous, and you get a free pen when you get your cannabis. But this is just to show you the size. But this is high potency cannabis, or what is called skunk in much of Europe. and it went, say, up to about 16%. Now, at this point, the government realized that every time they tested the potency of cannabis, there was a flurry of newspaper reports and a lot of political trouble. So they decided the sensible thing was not to fund this any longer. So nobody has known what's happening to cannabis potency until this year. We ourselves actually got a grant, and we've now tested about, say, nearly 500 samples confiscated by the police. And essentially what has happened is skunk has stayed much the same, but cannabis resin has started getting a lot more potent. So as cannabis was, particularly in Europe, the manipulation of the cannabis plant was mostly initially in Holland, where they're very good at growing tulips and other novel plants. So as you produce a plant that grows more THC, then the plant can't produce more CBD at the same time. So something like skunk or high potency cannabis in the UK would have maybe 16 or 17% of THC and almost undetectable CBD. So you lose this potentially ameliorating compound in some of the more modern forms available in the UK. And we wondered whether this has what kind of effect this has. So this is actually a study done by my wife, Marta De Forti, and this is 410 patients with their first episode of psychosis. 370 population-based healthy controls, all interviewed actually with the cannabis experience questionnaire, but all sorts of other risks, child abuse, family history, adverse life events, migration, altogether about 8 hours of interviews. And this is the effect of different types of cannabis on the risk of being a patient. So over here is the risk in those first standardized, those who've never used cannabis. Here are the people who have used hashish or cannabis resin. And you can see that it almost looked as if it was protective. It wasn't significant, but it certainly didn't increase the risk of psychosis. And here are those who were using the more high potency stuff. Doubling if you used it at all, threefold if you used it every weekend, and fivefold if you used it every day. In UK, it's called skunk because it's very smelly, like the little animal. So you can, if you have epidemiological data, you can actually calculate the population attributable fraction. So if you think you have a causal effect on an illness, and you have information about the general population, and you have information about your cases, then you can work out the population attributable fraction, and that for skunk use in South London is 24%. So that doesn't mean to say these are not people who may have a family history, or they may have been abused as a child. They may have other risk factors for a psychosis, but they're tipped over the edge in a quarter of cases into developing psychosis. You may wonder, I sometimes talk about psychosis, sometimes talk about schizophrenia. In my view, schizophrenia is just severe psychosis, severe and persistent psychosis. But in our case, we worked out at about 24%. This would be pretty high for Europe. The only place with a higher population attributable fraction is Holland, where it's about 35%. So about a third of cases of psychosis in Holland are attributed to cannabis use. We actually got on the front page of our local newspapers, and my wife was very pleased with this. So she texted her mum back in Sicily saying, "Mum, did you ever think I would be on the front page of the newspaper next to Victoria Beckham?" But I was interested in Benedict's numbers. We see about 600 cases of new cases of psychosis every year. That's for a population of about 1 million. And if we think a quarter of these can be attributed to cannabis, then that would calculate up about 7,500 new cases of psychosis in the UK. But actually, we are probably in the area where there is the highest consumption of high-potency cannabis. So 7,500 is an exaggeration. It might be more like 3,000 or 4,000. So that sort of number. So in Britain, everybody now knows that if you're given a gift of cannabis, you have to smell it to see what's in it. So even the Queen she gets lots of gifts. So when she's been given a gift of cannabis, she's very careful to say, does it smell like a skunk or not? So it's quite widely known. And actually, the UK is one of the few countries where cannabis consumption has been declining over the last 10 years. It's becoming more potent, but the consumption levels have been declining. So if cannabis-using psychotic patients are a discrete group, they should be different from non-using psychotic patients. And one factor which is quite clear is that they have an earlier onset. So this is the same study as I've been talking about. Here are people who have never used cannabis, and they present with, on average, an age of about 31. Whereas here are people who use a skunk every day, and they present, on average, at about, say, 25. Other studies have shown this as well. So cannabis use seems to bring forward the onset of psychosis. And a very interesting and curious finding is that cannabis users have a higher premorbid IQ and better premorbid social function than cannabis non-users. It's a bit odd because you think that in the general population they expect cannabis users to have, at least while they're intoxicated, to have impaired IQ, but at least among psychotic patients, the ones who use cannabis are smarter and more socially adept than the ones who don't. So this caused a lot of scratching of heads, till it was discovered, of course, that not only their IQ, but their premorbid IQ is higher. So before they started using cannabis, they also had a higher premorbid IQ. So I think the explanation for this is that a proportion of people who developed schizophrenia and other psychosis have neurodevelopmental impairment. And they have a copy number variant, or they've had obstetric adversity, something nasty has happened to their brain. The average IQ, what's the average IQ of an Englishman? Even the English, it's 100. Yes. But amongst English children who develop a psychosis, it's 95, because there is this developmental impairment. So we reckon that a proportion of people with schizophrenia and other psychosis have a developmental impairment, and that's their route into psychosis. But the cannabis users are smart, they're socially adept, they have lots of friends, they're sufficiently clever to be able to find a dealer and then con the money out of their parents in order to keep using without being found out, whereas the poor, developmentally impaired pre-psychotic individuals were not able to do that. So what about people who are already psychotic and continue to use cannabis? This is a meta-analysis carried out by Tabia Schuller. And so continued cannabis use after psychosis predicts adverse outcome, higher relapse, longer hospital admissions, more severe positive symptoms than for individuals who discontinue cannabis use. Actually, if you think that, say, there are people who've never used cannabis, their psychosis has nothing to do with cannabis, they have a sort of medium outcome. The ones who continue to use cannabis have a worse outcome. The ones who used cannabis and then stop, they have the best outcome. This is the sort of forest plot showing this in greater detail. At this side, a greater risk of psychosis relapse in the different studies with continued cannabis use. And you can see that the weight of the evidence is that continued use is associated with worse outcome. As you know, there's now more potent cannabinoids. I talk about high potency cannabis, 16%. Actually, now in the UK, you can get 40%. In Holland, you can get 60%. And I understand in Colorado and elsewhere in the States, I don't know about Canada, you can now get up to 90%. So, but of course, then we also now have the synthetic cannabinoids. In the UK, they're usually called spice. Or sometimes, is they called spice here? Yes, or K2? What is special K? Yes, it's ketamine. We have my godson is 9, and we were looking after him one day, and he came to our institute to pass the time, and he was on his computer most of the time, but he got fed up and he said, could I come to a lecture? So we took him to a lecture where somebody gave a lecture about drug abuse and showed a special K as ketamine. So the next Saturday he went with his mum around the supermarket, and as they were going past the cereals, he said, Mum, they're selling illegal drugs here. So synthetic cannabinoids obviously are full agonists at the CB1 receptor, and users are much more likely to seek emergency treatment than users of regular cannabis. And of course, there are a lot of other effects, non-brain effects. Just because these are molecules that have never been tested. And you can get, some wag has called this the acute psychosis, schizophrenia, but it's an acute psychosis usually. One of the sad things is Professor Hoofman. Professor Hoofman is a pharmacologist who spent 25 years developing new cannabinoid compounds to aid research into MS and AIDS and chemotherapy. And he developed 450 different cannabinoids, which are called GWH1, GWH45, GWH120, and so on. But in 2007, some German people discovered that they could use his compounds as marijuana substitutes. And so sadly, he's now famous as the man who produced all these different compounds. He says, it bothers me that people are so stupid as to use this stuff, but actually, if one's going to use synthetic cannabinoids, it's much better to use something that says JWH on it, because at least he's tested it in animals. The other ones are not tested on any. They just take a molecule in China or Israel or India and fiddle about with the molecule till they get a new substance that seems to hit the CB1 receptor. But of course, they don't test whether it has renal or cardiac complications. So it's better to use JWH if one is using these compounds. So what about this question of cannabis and the incidence of psychosis? We've been doing a very big first episode study across Europe with 16 sites. And in each country, we've tried to take a big urban area and a less urban area and compare the incidence and measure. So we've gone out and tried to get every first case of a psychosis in Cambridgeshire or in Clermont-Ferrand in France or in Palermo in Sicily. And the methodology has been the same in every case. And I guess you probably know that recent evidence is that the incidence of schizophrenia and of psychosis varies quite a lot. And in Europe, it varies quite a lot too. And there are not many things that the UK leads the world in, but we lead the world in, at least in Europe, in psychotic disorders. So we have an incidence of 61 per 100,000 in the UK. Amsterdam came next with 47, then Paris, and then most of the rural areas were small, but the big cities in southern Europe had low rates. So, for example, here is Madrid, 24 per 100,000. Here is Barcelona, 12 per 100,000. Palermo, which is over 1 million people, 11 per 100,000. And the lowest in Santiago, which is northern Spain, 6 per 100,000. So there's a huge difference. My wife is actually from Palermo. She always says, why on earth did I leave Palermo and come to London and increase my risk of psychosis 6 times? So what could the reasons be? Oh, excuse me. So I don't say. So why should people in London and Amsterdam and Paris have higher risks? What is protective about Spain and Italy? Could it be sunshine? Could it be the Mediterranean diet? What do they have that we don't have in London and Holland? Could it be the Pope? It seems the new Pope is obviously a very amazing person, but it seems unlikely that it could be that. I think one of the big effects is migration. And we know that migrants have an increased risk, even into Canada, though not to the same extent as into Europe. And if you take away migrants, then you halve the differences. But it does look as if there is a relationship, and we're just in the middle of calculating this properly. But it's London and Amsterdam that have the highest use of cannabis and have available high-potency cannabis. High-potency cannabis is not available in many places in southern Europe. For example, in Palermo, we only found 2 people who had ever used high-potency cannabis. They were both controls, and they'd both used it on a weekend trip to Amsterdam. So we can't say for sure, but it looks like one of the contributing factors to change in incidence may be high-potency cannabis. The last question I want to address is, do cannabis users have a greater predisposition to schizophrenia? And we can now measure predisposition to schizophrenia by what's called the polygenic risk score. So now there are 256 areas of the genome which are statistically significantly associated with risk of schizophrenia. So lots of tiny little genes are all contributing, just like genes contributing to height or to diabetes or asthma. And what you can do is you can add up all the risk alleles to see who is at high risk and who is at low risk of psychosis. People who are in the top 10% are 7 times more likely to develop a psychosis than people in the bottom. So if you want to know, are cannabis users more prone to schizophrenia, then you can test them for the polygenic risk score. And this is what Dr. DeForti has done. And so this is the polygenic risk score in controls. Here are people who've never used, and here are people who have said, yes, they have used cannabis. And you can see that the people who have never used have actually got a higher predisposition to schizophrenia than the people who have used. And over here you can see this is cases, and it's the same in the cases. The cases who have never used have a higher predisposition. It's not. It's only significant because we have about 1,500 of each. So, but the main point is that the polygenic risk score for schizophrenia as a measure of genetic predisposition does not predict cannabis use, either in controls or cases. So let me conclude. Administering THC can cause an acute psychosis, which is moderated by CBD. Heavy use of cannabis, especially the high-potency varieties, is associated with greater risk of psychosis. Cannabis-using psychotic patients have an earlier onset, better premorbid function than non-using psychotic patients. They have a worse outcome if they continue to use cannabis. I think there is now sufficient evidence for a causal effect to merit a public education. Now, can we prove that cannabis causes psychosis or causes schizophrenia? How did we prove that tobacco causes lung cancer? Well, you may remember that what they did was they took poor little mice, and they put tar on their skin, and eventually they grew little neoplasms. But they recognized what a neoplasm is, and they said, this is like a neoplasm that you get in the lungs. We do not have a model for schizophrenia, so we do not know what to produce. Would we be producing damage to some area of the hippocampus? Would we be producing latent inhibition abnormalities? What we would be producing? There is no model of psychosis, so there is no way of absolutely proving that child abuse or adverse life events or genes actually cause a model for psychosis or for schizophrenia. But so far, I think, although we cannot prove that definitely, I think there is sufficient evidence to merit public education about the risk of psychosis. And in the UK, there has been, perhaps by accident, but quite a lot of discussion in the media. And I think this is one of the reasons why our consumption of cannabis has dropped a bit. Thank you for listening.
Just following on the question that Dr. Fisher got, what about the under 18s? If they're a particular risk, what are the public health implications of that?
Well, we have the luxury of watching North America. So there is no significant pressure for legalization in the UK at present. I always say it's very expensive to do studies on rats or monkeys. You have to heat their cages, you have to feed them, they get the cages are inspected and so on. So it's very, very expensive. Americans and Canadians come for nothing. So we are just going to wait and see what happens. And so it's very interesting to see. If it's a great success, then we will perhaps legalize. If not, then we'll continue to be more cautious.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Do you have any insight of what would be the mechanisms whereby the risk for psychosis would be mediated by use of cannabis?
So we know that most illicit drugs induce a release of dopamine in the striatum. And you can easily show in animals the effect of THC on release of dopamine. It's been harder to show this in humans. And there have been 3 studies, 3 PET studies, one came out saying definitely shows an effect. It was on seven people. Another quite small one did not have an effect. Not significant. Then they reanalyzed it, and it did have an effect. We did a SPECT study, and we got a trend. So I think it's probably that there is a small effect on dopamine, but nothing like the effect with amphetamine or cocaine. When you actually look at them, if you take ordinary acute psychotic people, they have an increase in striatal dopamine, which correlates with their symptoms. If you look at cannabis users, they have decreased dopamine, like most drug addicts. I guess that's one of the reasons why they have to keep craving. But if you actually stress them a little bit or give them a little bit of amphetamine that brings their dopamine levels up to those of the rest of us, then they go psychotic. So one suggestion is that they develop that with the continued use of cannabis, actually, like other drug users, they drop their striatal dopamine level, their synthesis goes down, but those who are vulnerable to psychosis may somehow develop supersensitivity of the D2 receptor. And there's a lady called Ginovart, actually, who used to work in Toronto, is now in Switzerland, who's done a lot of animal studies suggesting that chronic use of THC does induce a supersensitivity of the receptor. When we've looked at individual genes which might increase risk, and this is before polygenes, the polygenic risk score came out, we found that the two which did seem to have an effect were the D2 receptor gene and AKT1, both of which are postsynaptic. So you could have a model, it's a bit waving of hands, saying that with continued cannabis use, you may get supersensitivity of the receptor. Now, of course, so these are people, cannabis users, who are psychotic, who have low striatal dopamine. They come into us, they're psychotic. What do? We give them dopamine blockers, which probably increases their craving. So we're trying to block the level of dopamine in the associative striatum, and probably by accident we drop it in the ventral striatum as well. And this probably makes them head for the door to try and get some more cannabis. So I think probably we should, actually the best drug is clozapine, which of course is less of a D2 blocker.
Thank you. Another question?
You indicated that cannabis users were generally more intelligent than the non-users. The question remains, is that a genetic factor or epigenetic factor in terms of their social class and the environment in which they grew up? Which is causing the reaction?
Yes, so I didn't mean to imply that in the general population that cannabis users are more intelligent. I think cannabis users in the general population are just representative of the general population, at least in Europe. But it's more the fact that people with psychosis are not, their cognition is not representative of the general population. They have a developmental impairment of their cognition. The cannabis users are just like the normal controls. But of course, you raise a very interesting question of the role of epigenetics. And as you probably know, that the best way to find out whether somebody has been a heavy smoker or not is not to ask them. It's better to look for the epigenetic signature, that you can accurately estimate how much tobacco somebody has consumed in their life by doing epigenetics on them. So we are actually now trying to, or again, particularly my wife, Marcia DeForti, is looking to see, is there an epigenetic change in people who are using cannabis? So we might have an answer in a few years.
Thank you.
Maybe we have time for the last question.
The producers of medical marijuana can arrange to have more CBD or more THC. In view of the evidence that high potency THC has risks and CBD could be protective, do you think there's any role in encouraging, once it's publicly available, to emphasize the higher CBD, or is there no evidence that this would be protective?
Well, we actually have a grant from the UK Medical Research Council, which is called towards a safer type of cannabis, and so what we're actually trying to do is to fiddle with these ratios and see at least what can we do in terms of acute experimental studies. I have to say that we, in clinical practice, for the last few years, what we have been doing is our high potency user, somebody who's taking 5 or 10 joints of skunk a day, it's a bit like the alcoholic. We try and get them to stop, but if they won't stop, you say, well, why don't you go back to drinking a few lagers or a few pints of beer a day rather than 2 bottles of whiskey? And so we've been trying to persuade people to go back to old-fashioned hashish to resin. But unknown to us, the THC potency of resin in the UK between 2012 and 2017 has gone up to about 12%. So we are actually giving them bad advice. But I think your general point is that personally, I think there is some evidence, and it's not overwhelming, that CBD it does ameliorate the effect. The trouble, of course, is if you have something with, if you give people something that has more CBD than THC in it, then they don't like to take it because they don't get much of a kick out of it. So obviously you have to have a substance which is enjoyable to take.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.